So we just talked about economic regulation. We talked about social regulation. The other thing is that beyond economic and social regulation at the federal level, state and local governments can regulate on their own. They have their own power. Remember federalism? Federal government has power to regulate over certain things, and state and local governments have power given to them in the Constitution, their own state constitution, and because of that division between powers in the federal Constitution and the state rules, we have substantially different state and local regulations from state to state. These can be different things like building codes. They could be business licensing, professional standards, health and safety standards. Take, for example, if you get a teaching credential in California, can you teach in Florida? I don't know. But if you got a teaching credential in Ohio, could you teach in Illinois? Who knows? Like, they can set their own rules about professional standards and how we regulate. The same thing goes for driver's licenses or drinking laws or building codes. I remember when we remodeled our house in Kansas when I was a graduate student, I ran a specific I ran a flex line of gas to the gas water heater, and they came in to inspect it, and they said, "Oh, no, you've got to run hard pipe." So I ran hard pipe later, and then they checked it, and they said it was totally fine. I moved to Riverside, California, and I had to replace a water heater. So I ran hard pipe gas to the water heater, and they came in and they said, no, you have to use flex pipe. And I said, why would you do that? Well, they said, well, because we live in a place with earthquakes. Oh yeah, duh. Our building codes in California are significantly more stringent than, Minnesota, Wyoming, Wisconsin, any of those. So how we write rules, how we write laws, they can be different from state to state and significantly different from state to state. But the state and local governments have rules, have ability to regulate a variety of different things. The federal government can regulate things. But state and local governments do something else, which is different. They also administer national regulatory programs. So in other words, there might be a national program like clean air. The national government, the federal government will give money to the state to help the state, to pay for the state to enforce that national law. So we do air quality monitoring, we have federal education standards, we have different state educational standards. The federal government may send money or require that our state do certain things, then the state can require different things. And so this hodgepodge of local codes too with local boards of education between federal, state, and local board of education rules. Every little district can be a little bit different about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Let's take, for example, some schools have just an outright ban on having little pocket knives, and some of them don't. And some of them can say, we're going to expel students, and some of them say we're not going to expel students. Well, how's that different? Well, every little jurisdiction is a combination of national, state, and local standards on how they regulate safety in schools. Also with curriculum. So we talk a lot about the federal government, but state and local governments are actually really key in establishing different sort of regulatory environments in their area. Now, statutory mandates are the laws in how we're told to do things. So we can have mandates for economic regulation, mandates for social regulation. Economic regulation is broad discretion regulatory agencies, like things like you should do things that are just and reasonable. And then the standard is what's just and reasonable, and we're able to sort of say, oh, okay, well that's interesting. Like, it gives a lot of flexibility in how we make something just and reasonable. But then, like, sometimes with social regulations, you could have that broad discretion, but sometimes they're really, really, really detailed too. Like in the case of FDA's regulation of drugs, like a certain mortality rate or a certain curing rate is a standard in order to get that thing passed. So the way that we are exact or flexible in the requirements of that statutory mandate can vary pretty significantly. So who actually goes out and does the work? Congress passes the law, they write these mandates into law, they provide some flexibility, maybe some real direct descriptions of how to do that work, but then also that law gets delegated to a regulatory authority, and that regulatory authority ends up having to do the work. That's great. There is a valid assumption that those agencies are experts. Structural model, we talked about mining before, but literally these people know all the details about everything, more or less, that pertains to their job. That can be good and it can be bad. For example, they know all the details, but maybe they don't know how to put all those details in context in order to explain that to a congressional committee or to citizens who are overseeing it, or to help us understand why it's okay to allow some things but not other things. And so regulatory agencies have to figure out how to use their expertise in order to do the law in an equitable way. Usually when they try and figure out how to do that law, because Congress passes big, broad laws, the agencies have to make them specific and applicable to everybody. They usually try to make their decisions based on one of two criteria. One of them is cost-benefit analysis. This is a large, broad idea that says we want to get the best bang for our buck. It's a pretty popular ideology. So what we say is, if we regulate this way, it's going to produce this sort of benefit. And the balance should be that the costs are reasonable in comparison with the types of benefits that are given. This happened early on with President Reagan. He made that a requirement of regulatory agencies to do a cost-benefit analysis. But at the same time, some regulatory agencies are moving away from this cost-benefit analysis and saying, well, there's some things that we really, really want that just cost a lot of money, and we can't really justify their costs for the benefits that they have. So it's a general criteria to help us make a decision, but it's not the only criteria. Another criteria about what to regulate and how to regulate is risk assessment. This is essentially the idea that we will incur some risks just naturally being alive, and some of those risks we should really regulate and we should control, and some of those we should just accept as part of normal life. For example, every time we get an X-ray, we expose our body to particles and energy that can be really damaging to our cells. But the benefit of having an X-ray to identify like a fracture in your bone, or a chest X-ray to see if you have some sort of lung problem, that might be really, really helpful to save someone's life. And so we assume that if you're going to get an X-ray, that you're going to assume some of that risk in order to have a long-term benefit. Flying, for example, also exposes us to X-rays, because as we go up in the atmosphere, X-rays can penetrate through the atmosphere at higher levels much more readily. So how do we mitigate for some of that risk? Do we just say you can't do that because flying is going to expose you to something that's harmful? No, the benefit or the risk that we get is so small compared to the benefit that we get. So we say, well, some things are just okay. Some things are also just too risky. Life-saving drug treatments that are experimental, we wouldn't just want to throw out there with the chance that they might kill you, they might cure you. So a risk assessment is not based on costs and benefits. It's about how much risk are we willing to take and how much risk is there out in the regular world. So those are sort of like two criteria by which regulatory agencies make choices about how to implement laws or go out and regulate the public. Cell phones also put a lot of radiation near your face, but gosh, they're pretty awesome. So maybe that's okay. Now, if we're going to go out as a regulatory agency and try and translate this big, broad law into something that we can actually do, we have to have a procedure to make sure that our decision-making is wise and it allows for public comment and expertise. So Congress prescribed to federal agencies, and then the legislature prescribed to state agencies in almost every state, what we call administrative procedures. And the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, essentially set a way by which regulators have to consider implementing the law. It's established some different type of approaches. One of them was administrative rulemaking, which I think is fascinating, how we get rules that apply broadly to the public to implement a law. And I'll explain that in a second. And then adjudication is administrative law judges will come in and they'll evaluate whether or not agencies have followed protocol in approving rules, and then they can make some adjustments on how that agency is doing their job. So administrative rulemaking, for example, is the first way. I think it's pretty great. You've got these big, broad laws that aren't very specific, and they're given to very, very expert agencies. Okay, so how does that work? Agencies try to translate that law into something that everybody can do. One of my favorite examples is the assault weapons ban in 1994 at the federal level. There were a whole bunch of incidents that involved assault weapons, but assault weapons aren't really a thing. It's not a technical term. So Congress passed this 10-year ban on assault weapons, or whatever the length of the term was, but they passed a ban on assault weapons, and they said, can't buy yourself for 10 years unless it's already imported, blah, 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 blah. And they gave that to the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency. ATF took that law and they said, well, what's an assault weapon? Like, I can't just ban every gun. Like, what makes a weapon an assault weapon? And so after some considerations, what they did was they said, well, an assault weapon, they got public comment, they got, expert comments, and they said, well, an assault weapon has a detachable magazine. It's semi-automatic. It has maybe a bayonet lug. It maybe has a flash hider. It has a foldable or collapsible stock. It has a pistol grip. It has a fore-end pistol grip. And it has maybe a grenade launcher. They listed all these things an assault weapon could have. And then it said, if it has more than 2 of those things, that it's an assault weapon. Well, 3 is an assault weapon, but 2 is not. Yes. They had to make a rule so they could apply it generally. They couldn't say, well, we're going to ban AK-47s, we're going to ban AR-15s, we're going to ban HKG-3s, and they couldn't do that because then the manufacturer would just change the name. They also couldn't say, well, we're not going to allow Bushmaster rifles and Colt this, that, Heckler and Koch this, that, and the other, because that would discriminate against a specific manufacturer, and the law doesn't allow that, and the APA doesn't allow that. So what they had to do is they had to write rules that broadly applied to all of those things in sort of a generic, specific way. In other words, like, I don't care what brand does it, but if it has this criteria, then it meets the standard, and now it's an assault weapon. So agencies go through all sorts of things, like, what is clean water? Well, clean water has these sorts of criteria in it. The law might say you need to look for lead, you might need to look for these sorts of toxic chemicals, but at what level? Congress is not expert, and the science changes all the time. So Congress says look for these things in the law, but then the agencies go through and they say, well, this is an acceptable level, this is not an acceptable level, this is an acceptable level, and they go through and they write rules about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Now, the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, says, well, if you have a small rule change, what you have to do is put it on the Federal Register for 30 days. You get public comment. The people comment back. And they have to respond to all the comments. The agencies respond to all the comments. And then after 30 days, that rule becomes how we enforce the law. If it's a big rule change, it's 60 days. So you write the rule about how you're going to implement the law. You put it on the Federal Register for 60 days. And then after 60 days, of public comment, you have to respond to those public comments, and then after those 60 days, it becomes the law. So what we do is we allow people and citizens, especially affected citizens in that process, to help ensure that the agencies are following sound science, but that also that there's no discrimination in how the law would be implemented. And discrimination, I'm not talking about like individuals, I'm talking about like discrimination against a certain group of people, a certain brand or a company, because you can't write rules that specifically discriminate against like 1 or 2 manufacturers. If they did that, then the agency would be found to be acting arbitrarily and capriciously against those groups. So they have to write rules that are broad and general for the entire set of the public that's affected by that rule. Okay, adjudication is the other way that we do regulation. Adjudication is where administrative law judges within agencies hear in individual cases. These agencies end up saying, hey, look, we've got this thing going on, what do you think? And we can talk about that sort of more broadly in the court system. That's to say, courts make rules that affect agencies, and those rulings accumulate into a body of law that organizations have to follow. Most of the time what happens is an agency does something or fails to do something, and somebody brings a suit against them, and somebody rules whether or not that agency acted appropriately. So you could sue them that they didn't act. You could sue them that what procedures they used disproportionately affected you. Let's imagine you get shot by a police officer. You could sue that police department, or you could sue that officer individually. Well, if you sue that police department, what you're essentially saying is something in the rule process about how you engage a suspect with a firearm is not giving people the right, or is depriving that individual of some process that the agency should take into consideration. Now, let's say you win, that agency then might have to change the rules about how police officers engage with suspects. We actually see that in Mirandizing. So someone was deprived of their right, Miranda, to not self-incriminate. And because they brought that suit against that police department, essentially all the police departments now follow a different process in order to arrest an individual and bring them to court. Now, why does that matter?